Before I begin, I want to thank you for tuning in. It's not easy to share something this personal, but I feel it's a story that needs to be told. My own son, my only child, decided I was too much trouble, too old, and that my place was in the damp, cold basement of my own home. The home I'd worked my fingers to the bone for, the home where I'd raised him. He and his wife thought they could just shuffle me away like an old piece of furniture. But I wasn't finished, not by a long shot. This is the story of how they put me in the basement and how I, in turn, rented out the entire house from under them and had them evicted. Let me know in the comments if you've ever felt so thoroughly underestimated. The conversation, when it first happened, sounded so reasonable, so loving. Mark, my son, sat across from me at my kitchen table, the one I'd refinished myself after his father passed. His wife, Sarah, was beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a picture of concerned solicitude. "Mom," Mark began, his voice laced with that earnest tone he always used when he wanted something, "we've been thinking. You're all alone here in this big house. It's a lot for you to manage. We worry." I remember looking around my sun-filled kitchen, the roses I'd pruned just that morning nodding cheerfully outside the window. Alone? Yes. Lonely? Sometimes. Unable to manage? Not in the slightest. I'd managed this house for 40 years, through leaky roofs and broken furnaces, through raising him, and then through the quiet grief of widowhood. But I listened because he was my son. Sarah chimed in, her voice softer, almost too sweet. "We thought Mark could sell his place, it's much smaller anyway, and we could all move in here together. We could take care of you, Mom. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing." The idea, on its surface, had a certain appeal. The thought of family close, of laughter in these rooms again, of not always eating dinner alone. I'd poured so much of my life into Mark, ensuring he had the best education, helping him with the down payment on that very house he now proposed to sell. My sacrifices for him were countless, woven into the fabric of my being, never tallied, never regretted, until then. I'd always believed that love given freely would be returned in kind, perhaps not in measure, but certainly in spirit. So I agreed. I trusted them. That was my first mistake, a colossal one. The sale of his house was quick, and the day they moved in felt chaotic but hopeful. Boxes piled high, furniture draped in sheets. It was unsettling, but I told myself it was temporary, a transition to a new, shared life. They talked about renovations, about modernizing the kitchen, adding a deck. I nodded along, assuming my comfort would be a priority. Even started dreaming of teaching a future grandchild to bake in that new kitchen. The reality, however, began to dawn with chilling speed. My spacious, sunlit bedroom, the one overlooking the garden, was claimed by them. "It's bigger, Mom, more practical for us and our things," Mark had said, avoiding my gaze. Sarah had just smiled, a tight, unreadable expression. "And my new room?" Mark led me down the narrow, creaky stairs to the basement. It was a single, bare bulb that illuminated the space, a concrete floor, stone walls weeping damp in places, a small, grimy window high up that offered a view of mud and tangled weeds. A rickety old cot, salvaged from somewhere, was pushed against one wall, a thin mattress thrown on top. "We'll fix it up, Mom. Make it cozy," Mark mumbled, his voice echoing slightly in the cold, cavernous space. "Just temporary, until we sort things out upstairs." The air was cold, heavy with the smell of mildew and something else, something like forgotten things. My beautiful antique wardrobe, the matching dresser, my comfortable armchair, none of them would fit down here, even if I could bear to see them in such a depressing environment. They were still upstairs, probably shoved into a corner, or worse. I stood there, a knot of ice forming in my chest. "Mark," I said, my voice barely a whisper. This isn't what we discussed. This is a cellar." He shifted his weight, finally looking at me, but his eyes were hard. "It's fine, Mom. It's dry enough. We'll put a dehumidifier down here. You'll be fine. Besides, you wanted us to live with you, to help out. This is how it works best for everyone." Sarah appeared at the top of the stairs then, her voice floating down, sharp and clear. Is everything all right? Dinner's almost ready. Don't dawdle, Mark, he turned, eager to escape, leaving me standing there with a single bare bulb casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock my naivety. That night, lying on that lumpy cot, the cold seeping into my bones, the full weight of their betrayal began to crush me. This wasn't care. This was a callous, calculated move. They didn't want me. They wanted my house. The rhythmic drip of water somewhere in the darkness was the only sound, each drop a tiny hammer blow against the fragile shell of hope I'd harbored. The warmth of my own home was just a floor above my head, yet it felt a million miles away, stolen by the very people I had loved the most. I cried then, silent, bitter tears that soaked into the musty pillow, not just for the cold and the damp, but for the shattering of a lifetime of maternal devotion. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of discomfort and disrespect. The basement remained largely as it was. No cozy improvements materialized, no real effort was made. The dehumidifier Mark had promised eventually appeared, a noisy old thing that did little to combat the pervasive chill or the smell of damp earth that clung to my clothes, my hair, my very skin. I developed a persistent cough, a wheezing in my chest that worried me, but when I mentioned it, Sarah would just raise an eyebrow and say, "Oh, Mom, you're always worrying about something." "It's probably just a bit of dust," Mark would simply nod in agreement, eager to avoid any conflict with his wife or any real responsibility towards me. My meals were often an afterthought. Sometimes they'd call down that dinner was ready, and I'd climb the stairs, feeling like an unwelcome guest, to find them already halfway through their meal, the conversation halting awkwardly upon my arrival. Other times they'd forget, or Sarah would leave a plate covered with plastic wrap on the bottom stair, usually leftovers, cold and unappetizing. I started keeping crackers and a jar of peanut butter in a small tin beside my cot, a sad little pantry that underscored my isolation. The humiliation was a constant, gnawing presence. I, who had hosted countless family dinners in the bright dining room upstairs, now ate scraps in a basement, often alone. The memories of this house, once a source of comfort, now felt like taunts. I remembered teaching Mark to ride his bike in the driveway, the scraped knees I'd bandaged, the proud smile on his face. I remembered baking his favorite chocolate cake for every birthday, the kitchen filled with warmth and the scent of celebration. Where was that boy now? Vanished, replaced by this cold, calculating man who saw his mother as an inconvenience, a means to an end. Sarah, in particular, seemed to delight in small cruelties. She'd accidentally spill things on the basement stairs, then sigh loudly about how clumsy some people were. She'd talk loudly on the phone to her friends, within my earshot if I happened to be venturing upstairs to use the bathroom. The only one I was permitted to use, naturally, was the small, cold powder room off the kitchen, while they enjoyed the spacious master bath. Her conversations were often peppered with thinly veiled complaints about living with an elderly parent, the sacrifices they were making. Sacrifices. The irony was a bitter pill. I, who had sacrificed my youth, my energy, my savings for Mark, was now the one being portrayed as a burden. One afternoon, I heard them arguing upstairs. Their voices were sharp, carrying clearly through the floorboards. "She's always moping around," Sarah complained. "And honestly, Mark, that smell from the basement, it's starting to permeate the whole house. When are we going to properly seal it off?" "Seal it off? Like a tomb?" Mark's reply was mumbled, indistinct, but it was clear he offered no defense for me. Later that day, Sarah came down, a can of air freshener in her hand, and proceeded to spray it liberally around my small living space, the chemical floral scent clashing horribly with the mildew, making my head ache. "There," she said, with a tight, satisfied smile. "That's a bit better, isn't it?" She didn't wait for an answer. It was in those moments, the accumulation of countless small stabs of disrespect, that the initial shock and hurt began to solidify into something else. A cold anger, a slow-burning ember of indignation. They thought I was weak, finished, easily managed. They had made a grave miscalculation. I started to pay closer attention, to listen more intently. Not just to their words, but to the silences, the unspoken assumptions. They were already acting as if the house was theirs. They talked about refinancing their mortgage. There was no mortgage, I owned it outright. About what color they would paint their living room. They were so confident in their ownership, so dismissive of mine. The knowledge that the deed to this house, the legal document that proclaimed my sole ownership, was safely tucked away in my old handbag, hidden beneath a loose floorboard under my cot, became a small, secret comfort. It was a tangible link to my power, a power they had foolishly overlooked. The turning point, the moment the ember of indignation flared into a determined flame, came on a cold Saturday in November. They were hosting a dinner party. I'd heard them planning it for weeks, Sarah fussing over the menu, Mark talking about impressing his boss. Not once had they mentioned my inclusion. I'd assumed, foolishly perhaps, that I would at least be invited to make a brief appearance. That morning, Sarah came down to the basement, her face set in a look of strained patience. "Mom," she said, her voice overly bright, "we're having some important guests tonight, for Mark's career. It's going to be quite a formal affair, and, well, the house will be very crowded." She paused, looking around my damp little corner with unconcealed disdain. "It would probably be best if you just stayed down here tonight. Kept out of the way. We'll bring you a plate later, kept out of the way. In my own home." While they entertained in my dining room, using my china, my silverware, the crystal goblets I'd received as a wedding gift. The sheer audacity of it, the casual cruelty, struck me with the force of a physical blow. I simply stared at her, my throat too tight to speak. She took my silence for acquiescence. "Good," she chirped, already turning to leave. "I knew you'd understand." That evening, the sounds of laughter and music drifted down from upstairs, a cruel counterpoint to the silence and cold of my basement prison. I could hear the clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversations, Sarah's high-pitched laugh. Each sound was a fresh insult. They hadn't even bothered to bring me the promised plate. It was a deliberate, calculated exclusion designed to remind me of my diminished status. Sometime after midnight, after the last guest had departed and the house above had finally fallen quiet, I lay on my cot, shivering, not just from the cold, but from a rage so profound it almost choked me. That was it. The last straw. They had pushed me too far. The woman they thought was a frail, forgetful old lady, easily confined and controlled, was about to show them just how wrong they were. The hurt was still there, a deep, aching wound in my soul, but now it was overlaid with a steely resolve. They would not break me. They would not erase me from my own life, my own home. This house was mine, bought with my husband's hard work and my own careful stewardship. It held the memories of my entire adult life, the echoes of love and laughter, and yes, sorrow too, but it was all mine. And I would fight for it. Not with tears or pleading, not anymore. I would fight with cunning, and with the law on my side. The first glimmer of a plan began to form in the darkness. It was vague at first, a desperate wish more than a concrete strategy, but the core of it was clear. I had to reclaim what was mine. I had to make them understand the gravity of their misjudgment. I remember my old friend, Eleanor Vance, who had been a paralegal for years before she retired. No, that wouldn't do. I needed someone current, someone formidable. My mind drifted to a name I'd seen on a local advertisement, a law firm specializing in property and elder rights. Ms. Albright. The name sounded strong, dependable. Tomorrow, I decided, I would find a way to call Ms. Albright. I spent the rest of that night not sleeping, but thinking, planning, a strange sense of calm descending over me. The path ahead was uncertain, perhaps difficult, but for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope, a spark of my old self returning. They had mistaken my quiet endurance for weakness. They were about to learn the difference. My mind raced, considering the obstacles. How would I contact a lawyer without them knowing? How would I pay for her services? My pension was modest, and Mark and Sarah had subtly taken control of my bank accounts to help manage things, they'd said. But I had a few pieces of jewelry, heirlooms from my mother, hidden away with the deed. They were precious to me, but my dignity, my home, my very self were more precious still. The next morning, I feigned a deeper cough than usual, complaining of chest pains. Sarah looked irritated, but Mark, perhaps with a flicker of guilt or fear of actual medical expenses, reluctantly agreed I should see a doctor. "Fine, Mom, I'll make you an appointment. But try not to make a fuss, this was my chance." At the doctor's office, after the checkup, which confirmed the damp was indeed affecting my lungs, I asked to use the receptionist's phone, citing a need to call a pharmacy. Instead, I dialed the number from Ms. Albright's firm, my heart pounding. I kept my voice low, explaining my urgent need for a consultation regarding a property and a delicate family situation. An appointment was made for 2 days later. Getting to that appointment was another hurdle. I told Mark the doctor wanted me to have some tests at the hospital and I'd take a taxi. He seemed relieved not to have to drive me himself and handed over a small amount of cash, grudgingly. That taxi ride to Ms. Albright's office felt like a journey towards liberation. Her office was calm, professional, and blessedly warm. Ms. Monica Albright was a woman perhaps in her late 40s, with kind eyes but a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately inspired confidence. I found myself pouring out the whole sordid story, the initial promises, the basement, the neglect, the dinner party, the constant humiliation. I didn't cry, though my voice trembled at times. I laid out the facts, my voice growing stronger as I spoke, fueled by months of suppressed indignation. Ms. Albright listened patiently, taking notes, her expression becoming increasingly grim. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Peterson," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "what they have done is unconscionable, and potentially, depending on a few factors, constitutes elder abuse. But more immediately, let's talk about the house. You said the deed is solely in your name." "Yes," I confirmed, "and it's fully paid off. My late husband made sure of that." "Excellent," she said, a small smile touching her lips. "That simplifies things considerably. Legally, the house is yours. You have every right to decide who lives there and under what terms." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a genuine warmth spread through me. To hear someone validate my ownership, my rights, was like a balm to my wounded spirit. "So, what can I do?" I asked, leaning forward. "I want them out, Ms. Albright. I want my home back. But more than that, I want them to understand. I want them to feel the consequences of what they've done." Ms. Albright nodded slowly. "There are several ways to approach this. We could issue a formal eviction notice, giving them a statutory period to vacate. However, given their current attitude, they might try to fight it, drag it out, make things unpleasant." She paused, then continued. "Or there's a more definitive approach. One that reasserts your control in a very clear way and potentially provides you with an income stream, allowing you to live comfortably, perhaps elsewhere if you choose." While this is resolved, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "You could rent out the house, Mrs. Peterson," she said simply, "to a third party. As the legal owner, you have every right to enter into a tenancy agreement. Once the house is legally leased to new tenants, your son and his wife would, in effect, be unlawful occupants if they refuse to leave. The new tenants, with our assistance, would then have the right to occupy the property, and your son and daughter-in-law would have no legal standing to remain." The audacity of it took my breath away for a moment. Rent out my own house from under them? It was brilliant. It was unexpected. It was a strategy that would hit them where they were most complacent, their assumed ownership and control. "They would have to leave?" I asked, needing to hear it confirmed. "Yes," Ms. Albright affirmed. "They would receive notice to vacate to allow the new, legally contracted tenants to move in. Failure to do so would result in formal eviction proceedings, but this time, initiated not just by you, but with the backing of a new leaseholder. It strengthens your position considerably." A slow smile spread across my face. It was perfect. It wasn't just about getting them out. It was about the profound irony, the poetic justice. They had treated me like an unwanted tenant in my own home, relegating me to the worst part of it. Now, they would become the unwanted occupants, forced out by a legitimate tenancy they couldn't contest. "Ms. Albright," I said, my voice firm, "that is exactly what I want to do." We then discussed the practicalities. finding a reliable tenant or a property management company. The legal notices required. The timeline. Ms. Albright assured me her firm could handle all the details discreetly. I showed her the small velvet pouch containing my mother's jewelry. "This is all I have for payment right now," I confessed. She waved a dismissive hand. "We can arrange a payment plan, Mrs. Peterson, or take our fees from the first rental income."
Don't worry about that.
"Our priority is to secure your home and your peace of mind." Leaving her office that day, I felt taller, lighter. The damp chill of the basement seemed a distant memory, replaced by the warmth of a burgeoning plan. The game had changed. I was no longer a passive victim. I was an active participant in my own rescue and soon in their reckoning. The weeks that followed were a strange dance of secrecy and feigned normalcy. I returned to the basement, to the cold and the damp, but it felt different now. It was no longer just my prison. It was my temporary hiding place, my planning headquarters. Every snide remark from Sarah, every dismissive gesture from Mark, now served only to fuel my resolve, to reinforce the righteousness of my chosen path. Ms. Albright and I communicated discreetly. I'd use the library computer for emails or make brief, coded calls from a payphone when I could get out on the pretext of a walk for my health. She was wonderfully efficient. She found a reputable property management company willing to take on the house, sight unseen based on her professional recommendation and my clear title. They had tenants lined up, a young professional couple, ironically, looking for a spacious, well-maintained home in a good neighborhood. The irony wasn't lost on me. Ms. Albright drew up the tenancy agreement. I had to make one more trip to her office to sign it, a terrifyingly risky endeavor. I told Mark I had a follow-up hospital appointment across town and would be gone most of the day. He barely grunted his acknowledgement, already absorbed in some sports program on the large new television they had installed in my living room. Holding the pen to sign that document, my hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the enormity of what I was doing. This was it. The point of no return. I, Eleanor Peterson, was officially leasing my home. My home, where Mark and Sarah currently resided, believing themselves the masters of the manor. A small, almost mischievous smile played on my lips as I signed. This young couple, the new tenants, I asked Ms. Albright, are they aware of the situation? They are aware that the property is currently occupied by family members of the owner and that proper legal notice will be given for them to vacate, she explained. They are understanding and are prepared for a standard notice period before they can move in. The property management company, Henderson Properties, will handle the interface with them. Mr. Henderson is very discreet and professional. Henderson Properties. It sounded solid and personal. Perfect. I started to prepare in small ways. I carefully, secretly, packed a small suitcase with my most essential clothing, my important papers, including the deed, now more precious than ever, my late husband's photograph, and the few small sentimental items that defined my life. I hid the suitcase under a pile of old blankets in the darkest corner of the basement, a little escape pod ready for launch. I also started observing Mark and Sarah more closely, almost like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe. I noted their routines, their expenditures, the new clothes Sarah constantly bought, the expensive gadgets Mark acquired, all funded, I suspected, by the money they were saving living rent-free in my house, perhaps even dipping into my accounts more than I knew. They were so comfortable, so secure in their belief that they had won, that I was a nonentity. Their arrogance was their Achilles heel. One evening, I even accidentally left my old, very basic mobile phone on record, on the basement stairs while they were having a particularly loud argument in the kitchen about money. Sarah was complaining about not having enough for a spa weekend she wanted. "Well, if your mother wasn't such a drain," Mark began, then his voice lowered. I couldn't hear the rest clearly, but the initial words were enough. A drain. That's what I was to them. The recording was probably inadmissible in any legal sense, but for me, it was another small piece of flint, hardening my resolve. The tenancy agreement was signed. Mr. Henderson of Henderson Properties was ready. Ms. Albright had prepared the formal notices. All that remained was to set the plan in motion. The agreed-upon date for serving the notice was just a week away. It felt like the longest week of my life, each day stretching out, filled with a mixture of trepidation and a fierce, almost exhilarating anticipation. I was on the cusp of reclaiming not just my house, but my self-respect. The day Ms. Albright's associate, a stern-looking young man in a crisp suit, arrived to serve the papers was an ordinary Tuesday. I was, of course, in the basement, mending a torn seam in one of my old cardigans. I heard the doorbell, a sharp, authoritative ring, very different from the casual taps of delivery drivers or Sarah's friends. Then I heard Mark's voice, initially annoyed, then shifting to confusion, then to outright disbelief. The young man's voice was lower, calmer, but carried an unmistakable air of legal authority. I couldn't make out the exact words from the basement, but the tone told me everything. A few minutes later, the front door slammed shut with a violence that rattled the single basement window. Then came the thud of heavy footsteps on the stairs, not coming down to me, but pacing agitatedly in the living room above. Then Sarah's shriek. "Mark, what in God's name is this? Eviction? From whom? This is our house." Her voice was shrill, laced with panic and fury. Mark's reply was a furious growl. "It's from her. Your mother. She's rented out the house. To some strangers. We have 30 days to get out. 30 days." It was a standard notice period, legally sound. I had secretly hoped for 60, to give them more time to squirm, but Ms. Albright had advised that 30 days was firm and less likely to be contested on grounds of undue delay for the new tenants. Silence for a moment from upstairs. A stunned, shocked silence. Then, the basement door was flung open with such force it banged against the concrete wall. Mark stood there, his face puce, a sheaf of legal documents crumpled in his fist. Sarah was right behind him, her perfectly made-up face contorted with rage. "What have you done?" Mark roared, his voice echoing in the small space, his eyes blazing. "Have you lost your mind, old woman?" Old woman. The familiar insult. But this time, it didn't sting. It almost made me smile. Sarah pushed past him, her eyes scanning my meager surroundings as if looking for evidence of my sanity or lack thereof. "You can't do this to us. This is our home. We live here. After everything we've done for you, letting you live here," the sheer, unadulterated gall of that statement almost made me laugh out loud. "Letting me live here? In my own house, while they confined me to the cellar." I rose slowly from my cot, my mending falling to the floor. I met Mark's furious gaze, then Sarah's. For the first time in months, I felt no fear, no intimidation. I felt powerful. "Actually, Mark," I said, my voice surprisingly calm and steady, "this is my house. The deed is in my name. I have owned it, free and clear, for over 20 years. And I have decided to rent it out." "Rent it out?" Sarah shrieked. "To who? Why?" "You're doing this just to spite us." "My reasons are my own," I replied coolly. "But yes, you could say I was no longer comfortable with the previous living arrangements. The new tenants have signed a legally binding lease. They will be moving in on the 1st of next month. You have until then to vacate the premises." Mark looked like he was about to explode. You conniving old witch. "We'll fight this. You can't just throw us out on the street." "I believe you'll find that I can," I said, my gaze unwavering. "Ms. Albright, my lawyer, has assured me that everything is perfectly legal. If you attempt to stay beyond the notice period, you will be forcibly removed as trespassers. I wouldn't advise that. It would be quite embarrassing for you, especially with your boss, Mark. If there's a scene," the mention of his boss seemed to momentarily deflate him. Sarah, however, was not so easily deterred. She switched tactics, her voice suddenly dripping with false concern. "Mom, please. Think about this. Where will we go? What about us? We sold our house to come here, to be with you, to take care of you." I allowed myself a small, tight smile. "Oh, I think you'll manage, Sarah. You're both young and resourceful. You found a way to move in here. I'm sure you'll find a way to move out. As for taking care of me, well, let's just say your definition of care and mine differ significantly. Mark slumped against the doorframe, the fight visibly draining out of him, replaced by a dawning horror as the reality of his situation began to sink in. "I don't understand," he mumbled, looking genuinely bewildered, like a child who'd been caught with his hand in the cookie jar and couldn't comprehend the punishment. "Why would you do this to your own son?" That question, after everything, was almost too much. "My own son," I repeated softly, a deep well of sadness momentarily surfacing amidst the triumph. "My own son put me in a damp basement and treated me like a prisoner. My own son forgot every sacrifice I ever made for him. Perhaps, Mark, you should be asking yourself why you did what you did." He had no answer. He just stared at me, his crumpled legal papers a testament to his spectacular underestimation of the old woman he thought he could control. The silence stretched, heavy and profound, broken only by the distant hum of the dehumidifier, a sound that now, strangely, felt like a quiet victory song. The days that followed the serving of the eviction notice were a chaotic symphony of disbelief, anger, and dawning panic from Mark and Sarah. They swung wildly between furious accusations hurled down the basement stairs and desperate, wheedling attempts at reconciliation, usually when they thought I might be softening. I remained polite, distant, and utterly immovable. "The decision is made," I would repeat calmly. "The house is leased. You need to make arrangements." Their immediate reaction was to try and rally support. Sarah called her mother, who, from what I overheard of the one-sided, tearful conversation, offered sympathy but no practical solutions or spare rooms. Mark, I believe, tried to talk to his aunt, my sister, but Caroline had always seen through Mark's entitled attitude and Sarah's saccharine facade. I'd spoken to Caroline myself a week prior, a brief call to let her know things might be changing, and though I didn't give her all the grim details, she'd understood enough. "It's about time you put your foot down, Eleanor," she'd said. "That boy has been taking you for granted for years, so no help came from that quarter." Their carefully constructed world, built on the assumption of my indefinite passive compliance and the free use of my largest asset, was rapidly crumbling. They seemed genuinely astonished that there would be consequences for their actions. It was as if they believed their desire for my house automatically conferred ownership upon them. The arrogance was breathtaking. Sarah, in particular, took the news hard. Her social standing, which she clearly felt was enhanced by living in my spacious, well-located home, was about to take a significant hit. I overheard her on the phone with a friend, her voice tight with unshed tears. "I don't know what we're going to do. We'll have to find some awful little apartment." After all this. After all what? After all their scheming and deceit? I'd spend my days in the basement, listening to their frantic activities above. There were loud arguments, slammed doors, and the sound of drawers being yanked open and slammed shut as they presumably started to confront the reality of packing. One afternoon, Mark came down, his face pale and drawn. He looked truly wretched. "Mom," he began, his voice hoarse. "Can't we talk about this? There must be some way we can pay you rent. A fair amount. We need more time. We can't find a place this quickly." For a moment, a flicker of the old maternal instinct stirred. The urge to soothe, to fix. But then I remembered the cold, the damp, the dismissiveness, the casual cruelty. I remembered lying on that cot, listening to them laugh upstairs. "Mark," I said, keeping my voice even, "the house is legally leased to new tenants. Henderson Properties has a contract. I cannot break that contract. And frankly, even if I could, I wouldn't. You had your chance to live here respectfully. You chose not to." He looked down at his hands. She's not taking this well." "I imagine not," I replied, a touch of dry irony in my tone. It's never pleasant to have one's comfortable arrangements disrupted, especially when they come at someone else's expense. He looked up, a flash of his old anger returning. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" I considered his question. Enjoying it? No, not exactly. There was no joy in seeing my son so distressed, even if he had brought it entirely upon himself. But there was a grim satisfaction, a profound sense of justice being served. "I'm experiencing a sense of order being restored, Mark," I said finally. "This is my house. I am taking back control of my life and my property. If that causes you discomfort, then perhaps you should reflect on the actions that led us to this point." He turned and stumped back up the stairs, defeated. The legal weight of the signed lease and the involvement of Ms. Albright and Henderson Properties seemed to have finally convinced them that my decision was irrevocable. They couldn't bully or manipulate their way out of this one. They were dealing with contracts with external agencies, not just their old mother whom they thought they could easily sideline. I made my own quiet preparations. Ms. Albright had arranged for my small suitcase to be picked up by a trusted courier and taken to a temporary, comfortable serviced apartment she had found for me. I would move there the day before Mark and Sarah were due to vacate. It was important, she'd advised, that I not be present during their actual departure. It would be cleaner, less confrontational. The new tenants were scheduled to move in 2 days after the deadline, allowing time for a quick clean and lock change. The plan was meticulous, just as I'd wanted. As the end of the 30-day notice period approached, the sounds from upstairs became more frantic, the scraping of furniture, the thud of boxes being dropped. The end of their unearned reign was near. The final week of their occupancy was tense. The arguments upstairs were less frequent, but more bitter when they occurred. I could sense the despair setting in. They had, it seemed, found a small, rather undesirable apartment across town, a significant downgrade from the spacious comfort of my home. Sarah's laments about this were audible even in the basement, laced with resentment for Mark for getting them into this mess, and, of course, for me, the architect of their downfall. On the second-to-last day, before I was due to quietly slip away to my temporary apartment, Mark came down to the basement one last time. He looked older, tired, the arrogant swagger gone. He didn't speak for a long moment, just stood there, looking around the dismal space that had been my enforced home for months. We're moving most of our stuff tomorrow," he said, his voice flat. "The movers are coming in the morning," I nodded, saying nothing. "Mom," he hesitated. I know things haven't been good, an understatement of epic proportions. "I just want to say,
I'm sorry."
For this." He gestured vaguely at the basement. It was the closest he'd come to an apology, but it felt hollow, prompted more by his current predicament than by any genuine remorse for his treatment of me. "It's a little late for apologies, Mark," I said, my voice devoid of the anger I once felt, now replaced by a weary resignation regarding him. "But I acknowledge that you said it." He shifted uncomfortably. "So, where will you go? When the new people come?" He still didn't fully grasp that I had orchestrated everything, that I had my own plans. "I have made my arrangements," I said simply. "You needn't concern yourself with me." He looked at me then, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Was it confusion? Resentment? Or perhaps, just perhaps, a dawning, reluctant respect for the mother he had so thoroughly underestimated? "You really thought this all through, didn't you?" he said almost to himself. "Yes, Mark," I replied.
"I did.
I had a lot of quiet time down here to think." He nodded slowly, then turned and left without another word. That was the last I saw of him in my house. The next morning, very early before the movers were due, a discreet car arranged by Ms. Albright collected me and my small, pre-packed bag. I didn't look back as we drove away. My heart felt surprisingly light. The day of their official departure, I was settled in my temporary apartment. It was small, but clean, bright, and blessedly warm. Ms. Albright called me in the late afternoon. "It's done, Eleanor," she said, a note of satisfaction in her voice. "They're out. Mr. Henderson's team is there now, assessing the property and arranging for the locks to be changed immediately. He said they left it in a bit of a state, as expected, but nothing that can't be rectified with a good cleaning. A bit of a state." I could only imagine. But it didn't matter. They were gone. My house was mine again. Ms. Albright continued. "Mr. Henderson did mention there was a rather heated exchange when Sarah realized they'd left behind a box of her good shoes and tried to get back in. The new locks were already being fitted. She was quite vocal, apparently. I almost smiled. Poetic justice, indeed. The following day, Ms. Albright drove me to the house. As we pulled up, I saw Mr. Henderson, a tall, kindly-looking man, supervising a cleaning crew. He greeted me respectfully. Mrs. Peterson, welcome back to your home, my home. The words sounded incredibly sweet. I walked through the rooms, my rooms. They felt different, emptier, but also cleaner, lighter. The oppressive atmosphere generated by Mark and Sarah's presence had lifted. There were scuff marks on the walls, a few stains on the carpets, evidence of their careless, entitled occupation. But these were superficial wounds, easily healed. The house itself, my sturdy, beloved house, felt like it was breathing a sigh of relief, just as I was. I stood in the living room, sunlight streaming through the windows they had so often kept curtained, and a profound sense of peace settled over me. It wasn't just about the house. It was about reclaiming my dignity, my agency. I had faced betrayal and disrespect, and I had not crumbled. I had fought back, intelligently and effectively. The old woman they had tried to discard had proven to be far more resilient and resourceful than they could ever have imagined. The power I felt wasn't a loud, boisterous thing. It was a quiet, unshakable strength that came from knowing I had done what was right for myself, that I had honored the legacy of my home and the memory of the life I had built there. The basement door was open. I walked to the top of the stairs and looked down into the dim space. It no longer held any fear for me. It was just a basement, a part of my house, and it would be cleaned, aired out, and perhaps, one day, turned into a proper guest room or a hobby space. Its days as a makeshift prison were over, forever. The immediate aftermath was a period of quiet reclamation. With Mr. Henderson and his efficient team from Henderson Properties managing the new tenants who were due to move in the following week, I had a small window to supervise the deep cleaning and minor repairs the house needed. It was strangely satisfying to see the grime of Mark and Sarah's occupation being scrubbed away. Every swept floor, every polished surface, felt like a cleansing of the spirit as much as the house. The new tenants, a pleasant young doctor and her architect husband, were respectful and appreciative of the home's character. They signed a 1-year lease, and the monthly rent they paid was more than enough to cover my expenses in the comfortable, modern apartment Ms. Albright had helped me secure in a quieter part of town, closer to amenities and a lovely park. I had decided not to move back into the big house myself, not immediately anyway. The thought of living there alone again after everything felt a little daunting. The rental income gave me freedom, options I hadn't had before. It was a buffer, a source of independence. Ms. Albright handled all the financial arrangements, ensuring a portion went to her fees, as agreed, and the rest was deposited into a new bank account that only I controlled. The sense of financial security, after months of feeling my resources being subtly siphoned away, was incredibly empowering. News of Mark and Sarah trickled back to me, mostly through my sister, Caroline, who still had occasional, reluctant contact with Mark. They were, as predicted, struggling. The small apartment they'd rented was expensive for its size and location. They were grappling with bills they hadn't had to consider while living under my roof. Sarah, apparently, was finding it difficult to adjust to a less affluent lifestyle. There were whispers of arguments, of financial strain, of Mark's job performance suffering due to the stress. I felt a pang of something complex, not pity, exactly, more a sad acknowledgement of the path he had chosen. He had traded his integrity and his mother's love for a temporary illusion of comfort and control, and now he was paying the price. There was a profound, almost biblical sense of poetic justice in their predicament. They had sought to dispossess me, to reduce me to a dependent, and in doing so, had ultimately dispossessed themselves of comfort, security, and familial goodwill. One afternoon, about a month after they'd moved out, my new phone rang. It was Mark. His voice was hesitant, unsure.
Mom?
It's Mark. I know who it is, Mark. I replied, my tone neutral. I was just wondering how you are. I am very well, thank you, I said, and it was the truth. I was sleeping soundly in my warm bed, eating well, enjoying short walks in the park. My cough had disappeared.
Oh.
Good, an awkward pause. Look, Mom, about what happened. I've been doing a lot of thinking. I waited. Maybe we made some mistakes. I echoed, allowing a hint of incredulity into my voice. Mark, you relegated your mother to a damp, unhealthy basement in her own home. You treated her with contempt and neglect. Those weren't mistakes, those were choices. He was silent for a moment. Yeah, well, Sarah's been pretty miserable. This new place it's not great. We were wondering, maybe when these new tenants' lease is up, maybe we could work something out? We could pay rent, proper rent this time. The audacity, even now, was astonishing. Did he truly believe I would ever allow them back into my life, back into my home, after what they had done? Mark, I said, my voice calm but utterly final.
That will not be happening.
The house is a rental property now. And frankly, my peace of mind is far too valuable to jeopardize by revisiting a situation that was so deeply damaging. You and Sarah made your choices. Now you need to live with the consequences, just as I am living with mine. I could hear his sharp intake of breath. So that's it then? You're just cutting us off. I'm not cutting you off, Mark, I said softly, and this was perhaps the saddest truth of all. You cut yourselves off from me a long time ago, with your actions. I'm simply acknowledging that reality. I wish you well. I truly do. I hope you find happiness and learn from this. But my home and my life are no longer yours to disrupt. I ended the call then, a sense of closure settling over me. The last vestiges of misplaced maternal obligation had finally dissolved. My healing was progressing, and it involved clear, strong boundaries. My new life began to take shape, quietly and contentedly. The apartment Ms. Albright had found for me was a haven. It was smaller than the house, of course, but it was bright, modern, and easy to manage. I had a small balcony where I started a little container garden, filling it with herbs and cheerful geraniums. The complex had a communal lounge and organized occasional activities, and I slowly began to meet some of my new neighbors, other retirees mostly, with interesting stories and a welcoming attitude. I reconnected with old friends whom I'd somewhat neglected during the stressful months of living in the basement and, before that, during the later years of my husband's illness. We started having regular coffee mornings, joined a book club, even took a gentle yoga class together. It was astonishing how quickly my world expanded once I was free from the oppressive atmosphere Mark and Sarah had created. The rental income from the house provided a comfortable cushion. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough for me to live without financial anxiety, to treat myself to small pleasures, and even to start a modest savings account for any future needs or perhaps a little trip I'd always dreamed of. The true wealth, however, was the peace of mind. Waking up each morning knowing my day was my own, that I was safe, respected, and in control of my environment, was a luxury beyond price. I found a new purpose in volunteering at the local library twice a week, helping children discover the joy of reading. Their uncomplicated enthusiasm was a balm to my soul. It reminded me of a younger Mark, before entitlement and greed had clouded his judgment. There was a touch of melancholy in that, a wistful sadness for the son I had lost, or perhaps the son he had never truly been. But that sadness no longer consumed me. It was a scar, a reminder of a past hurt, but it no longer dictated my present happiness. Occasionally, I would drive past my old house. I'd see the new tenant's car in the driveway, lights on in the windows, signs of a happy, normal life being lived within its walls. And I would feel a quiet sense of satisfaction. The house was being used as it should be, as a home, a place of warmth and security, not a tool for manipulation or a symbol of disrespect. It was still my house, legally and emotionally, but its role in my life had changed. It was no longer just a repository of past memories, but an asset that was actively contributing to my present well-being and future security. Mark did not call again for a long time. Caroline told me he and Sarah were still struggling, that their relationship was strained. Part of me hoped they would learn from their hardship, that they would grow, perhaps find some humility. But I knew that was their journey, not mine. My responsibility was to myself, to the life I was rebuilding. My dignity had been assaulted, but I had reclaimed it, piece by piece. My peace had been shattered, but I had painstakingly reassembled it, stronger and more resilient than before. The experience had taught me a harsh lesson about trust and the darker aspects of human nature, even within one's own family. But it had also taught me about my own strength, my own capacity for strategic thinking, and the importance of standing up for oneself, no matter how daunting the odds may seem. I was no longer Eleanor Peterson, the victim, the discarded mother. I was Eleanor Peterson, the quiet victor, the woman who had been put in the basement but had risen to reclaim not just her house, but her life. And that, I realized, was the greatest vindication of all. Not revenge, but a profound and lasting peace, earned through courage and resolve. The sun on my balcony felt warm, the scent of my herbs was fragrant, and the future, once a terrifying unknown, now stretched before me, filled with possibilities. I was content. I was free. And I was finally home. Not in a place, but within myself.